Chapter 14, Evaluation Approaches and Design. Okay, so we're going to continue from Chapter 13 talking about evaluation. Now, we're not going to go that in depth in evaluation, that's another course, but what I want to do or want to convey is that evaluation is really something that you need to pay attention to and plan out. Remember, you're trying to determine the effectiveness of your program and across all elements of your program. So the more extensive your evaluation plan, the better you'll be able to, speak to, what works, what didn't work, what kind of sort of worked within your program, and you can react to those findings and make revisions, again, in an effort to maximize the success potential of your program. Now, in terms of evaluation, you want to look at, there's various different approaches. So there's different elements of your program that require slightly different evaluation perspectives, and we want to understand that there are different types of of evaluations, and we want to apply those different types to create a comprehensive evaluation plan. Now, in terms of evaluation plan, we can look at designs, and we can, we've talked about summative evaluation in the sense that, um, you know, once the program is ended and we have the data in front of us, what are we going to do with that data to evaluate our program? Uh, Now, in terms of data collection, we'll speak about experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental designs, and that really has to do with your ability to randomize your participants into different evaluation groups. But I'll address that more as we go through this presentation. Okay, so formative evaluation, we've already addressed that. Again, the book is kind of says two different things. It talks about formative evaluation as occurring prior to implementation, and it lumps summative in with um, measuring impact objectives that occur during implementation and focusing on your long-term or your goal for the program once the program ends. But again, I just want to reiterate that formative evaluation can extend into program implementation, and in fact, that's something you should be doing, is collecting data to measure those objectives that their by when falls during the implementation time period, so that you can kind of have a sense of what the trends are. Are you trending towards a successful completion of the objective as expected or not? If you were to put this off until after the program ends, well, you really can't react to that particular instance, right? You'd have to make your revisions and apply it to any future implementation. So, again, my opinion, and the book does mention this here and there, but it's always a good idea to, if you have data coming in, to go ahead and start to start to analyze that data, and analyze it in a way that you can speak to meeting your objectives, which eventually are going to culminate in you being able to realize your program goal. So in terms of formative evaluation, let's talk through these elements that they're providing. Okay, so your justification and your evidence, that's something that you utilize to generate stakeholder support. So your justification, that's kind of your rationale for doing the program. Your evidence, what data have you collected that suggests that this would be a successful program? Okay, your capacity, basically you're looking at the strengths and weaknesses of your program personnel. Um, and this includes both your internal group, so your original group that's actually working on the program, but it can also extend to any external partnerships where you're bringing in people to assist with the program or expertise to assist with the program that they're not necessarily part of your core personnel group. But again, that's something that you want to look at. If your capacity is lacking, then that's going to impact your ability to meet your objectives and goal. Other thing you want to look at, your resources, right? So you've created a budget, you have your projected costs. Does your anticipated or your secured funding, does it cover all those projected costs? Again, if you have to cut out elements of your program because the budget doesn't support that, well, most likely that's going to be a problem. So let's go ahead and kind of reconcile that budget with available resources, just to make sure that you can cover all of the costs. So within this evaluation of resources, there's a couple specific things we can look at. Your cost identification analysis. Here's where you're looking at different implementation strategies or activities that you want to include in the program, and there may be more than one way to meet an objective through a variety of different strategies, and you're looking at each strategies in terms of how effective they are, and you're also considering, okay, well, how many resources are they going to consume? And if you have multiple strategies that have the same level of effectiveness, but there's various degrees of cost, well, certainly you'd want to go and select the cheaper option as a way to maximize utilization of resources. Okay, cost benefit analysis. Here's where you're looking at, typically we're expecting health benefits from this program. And if you want to reconcile those benefits against the amount of resources consumed, one approach would be to put a dollar amount to those health benefits, and you could have a justification, or at least you could see a return on investment and ROI. It's easier to see comparing dollars to dollars. How do you go about doing that? I would begin with a literature review, seeing if others have put a dollar amount on certain health aspects of programs, and try to build it from there. Your cost effectiveness analysis, here's where you're looking at your program effects, and think of your impact objectives as your program effects. So here you're basically putting a dollar amount to each objective, and again, the idea is that these objectives are going to help you meet a goal, and they're going to consume resources, right? Your how much change in your objective statement, if the bigger changes, right, theoretically are going to consume more resources. So here's where we kind of stop and analyze that in terms of resource utilization. Okay, consumer orientation. Basically, it's the appropriateness of the program and the way that the program is delivered and what strategies are selected to the needs of the target population, right? I keep using a term called tailoring the program to the specific target population needs. The customer orientation, that's where that gets addressed. Multiplicity, we've used this term before, but basically, instead of having a single strategy approach like a health education only program, we involve more strategies, and the more strategies, like you have behavior change or health communication, maybe voting behaviors, those types of things. The more variety you have, the higher your multiplicity. Typically, having multiple strategies is better than a single strategy approach. However, you can make the program so complex with having too many strategies that it becomes overwhelming for your target population. So, it's a balancing act. You're trying to find that tipping point. You want to have, adequate number of strategies, but not too many to overwhelm. So it can vary depending on the situation, the nature of the program, the target population you're working with. So it's something to keep an eye on. Support. Here you're evaluating what is your program doing to support the participants in a way that they're likely to maintain participation in your program all the way through implementation. Some programs do spend a lot of effort on creating support systems for participants, and other programs don't even consider that at all. And I would argue that we're going to be asking our participants to make behavior changes, and even simple behavior changes we recognize are needed in our own lives are difficult. So anything you can do to ease that difficulty, it's going to work out in terms of creating a higher number of participants that actually make it through the program. And again, that's going to help your evaluation. Okay, inclusion. So basically, you have a target population. Are you including a significant number of the target population in your program, such that the benefits they receive are going to translate back into the community? The book also includes evaluation of the suitability of external partners with the program. Accountability, basically your program staff have daily responsibilities. Are they keeping up with those responsibilities? Adjustment. So here's where the your reaction to your evaluation data comes into play. And basically, if we go through this, modified based on feedback. So again, you're allowing yourself opportunity to revise aspects of the program, again with the intention of maximizing the benefits received. Recruitment. Okay, so here's where your marketing comes into play, right? How well did you do with marketing at recruiting participants into your program, right? So you're going into a community, you're offering a health promotion program, right? What are you doing, right, to entice individuals from that community to become participants? Are you doing enough? Okay, reach basically addresses the extent of your marketing, right? Think about terms like your penetration rate, right? Is the word getting out? Is it being diffused through the community in a way that people are aware that, hey, this program's available, whatever marketing you're doing to sell that, right? To what extent is the community receiving that information? Response, typically we report this as response rate. So you would look at, okay, I marketed this program to 100 people and 50 people decided to participate. So your response rate would be 50%. And that's a pretty high response rate, but that's what we're looking at. If your response rate is too low, we need to think about, well, why is that? Is it it has to do with my marketing, has to do with my reach, is it the program identity? But the idea is that the more people that respond and participate in your program, the more that are going to receive the benefit. Okay, interaction and satisfaction are both kind of related. Basically, what's from the participant's perspective, okay, how did they like working with program personnel? Satisfaction, right? They come in with expectations based on our marketing materials. How well did the program live up to those expectations? Again, think about what these data are able to tell us about the program, how it's being received by the target population. Are there things that we can do better that would improve our participation? Process evaluation, again, we've talked about this. You're looking at the administration of the program. Um, you're looking at I designed this program on paper. How well am I following my protocols? So on and so forth. So it has to do not necessarily with the content of the program, but basically how it's being administered, how it's being delivered according to plan. Okay, so here are some things that we look at. So program fidelity, again, am I following the plan as designed? Dose, this is a term we've used before, but in terms of the strategies that you've selected for the program, how much exposure to each strategy are the participants receiving? That's going to be your dose. So if you're utilizing health education, well, how much health education opportunities do they have through program implementation? Is it a single session, or are there multiple sessions that happen over the course of the implementation? Well, that's going to be a difference in dose. Okay, recruitment. Basically, we're looking at our marketing. How are we notifying people of the program? How are we enticing them to participate? Reach. Kind of spoke in response, kind of talked about those types of things. And then the other thing to consider, and a lot of times I don't think this gets as much attention as it should, but it's the context. That's what separates your program design on paper, why, or helps to explain why there's varying degrees of success in terms of evaluation. On paper things may look appropriate, innovative. It's a great design. But when you go to put it into actual practice, right, the context of the situation can impact. Maybe you're going into a community that has experience with being involved with a lot of bad programs. Well, chances are that's going to influence their decision to participate in your program. So again, the more extensive your evaluation approach is, the more understanding you're going to have about the ability for your program to be effective. Okay, you can go to table 14.3 in the book to get a little bit more information about each of these procedures. But basically, the idea is that you're trying to generate data that can be utilized for your evaluation purposes, right? So focus groups, we're bringing in or involving members of the target population to kind of get a sense from their perspective, how the materials are being received. We can utilize surveys, interviews, key informant interviews here, where we select the interviewee based on kind of their knowledge about a particular aspect of the target population that we might not get if we were just to do a random focus group. Expert panel reviews. Here we convene an expert panel of people that are experts in either program design, implementation, data analysis, and kind of get them to look at our evaluation plan and give us feedback on, hey, you're doing a good job here, but you may want to address this evaluation element a little bit more, something like that. Quality circles, similar to a focus group, but the membership is made up of program personnel. Basically, we meet on a regular basis and kind of discuss things. And again, you're getting the perspective from your personnel group as the implementation goes forward. Protocol checklist, basically, so if your protocol says we're going to offer 3 education sessions on nutrition per week, right? Your checklist is, you look back over the week, say, okay, we did 3, we did 2, 5, whatever it is, but you're again, collecting that data. Gantt chart, presented that before. Again, it's just kind of a poster version of your timeline and a task that need to be accomplished and who's going to cover those tasks. So again, it's very helpful visual aid. Use of program and evaluation forms. So here you develop specific forms to help you collect data during the evaluation. And then direct observation. This is just, you're just observing participants as they go through the program. You're observing program personnel as they work with participants. Again, you're just trying to see things from different perspectives, and allowing those different perspectives to inform you how well your program's doing. Okay, pre-testing and pilot testing. So pre-testing really, what you're doing is it gives you an opportunity to collect baseline data and apply this to your measurable objectives. So if you said, by midpoint of the program, participants will have increased their physical activity levels by 50%. Okay, well, in order to evaluate if there was a 50% improvement, you need a baseline, right, to compare to. So pre-testing is where you kind of do all those things. So again, once you have all your objectives written out, you want to kind of start thinking about, okay, what data do I need? Where am I going to get it? Well, for any objective that has a percent change from baseline, well, you know that you're going to need baseline data. Then you need to start thinking about, okay, well, what type of data do I need? How do I ask the questions to collect the data? All those things go into it. And pre-testing kind of gives you an opportunity to do that. Pilot testing. Okay, so here's where you run through the program with a smaller group, again trying to see how the context of the situation may cause you to deviate from your plan as written. Now, one thing with pilot testing, they recommend that you deliver the pilot test program exactly as you would the real implementation. And in order to do that, well, you follow that same timeline. So pilot testing, while it does give you a lot of insight, and especially if there are some errors that occur that you can take an opportunity to correct before you apply it to the larger population, it's going to consume resources. And if you had to follow the same timeline, well, time is a very important resource that most people don't have a lot of. So you may not always be able to implement a pilot test as part of your evaluation plan. Okay, summative evaluation, I'll give you my thoughts on that. Right, summative evaluation starts once the program ends. You go back, you start reviewing your data. And like I said, the book kind of oscillates back and forth, and here they're saying they're including impact objectives in the summative plan, and certainly you can take that approach, but I recommend to include impact evaluation as part of your formative evaluation plan. So while the program is being implemented, you're collecting data, right? Start to analyze that data, evaluate that data, so you can get a sense of how your objectives are trending towards completion. I just think that gives you a little bit of a buffer to make revisions, again in an attempt to maximize the probability your program is going to successfully meet its goal. Another term that shows up here is confounding variables. Confounding variables, all right, so typically you set up an evaluation to look at an independent variable's effect on a dependent variable. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So I was looking at conducted a study once looking at the effect of a discrimination event on stress levels. Right. So my independent variable was discrimination. Okay. Did the person experience a discrimination event? Yes or no? Did that impact their stress levels? And one of the things we know about discrimination and stress is that there's individual variability in the outcome. So some people could experience a discrimination event and it bothers them a lot, right? It causes a lot of stress. Other people could experience a discrimination event and not be bothered by it. And so what that tells you is, well, there must be other factors in play, right? And we call those other factors confounding variables, right? Because some of the variability in the dependent variable, right, is attributed to that confounding variable. So in the example of my discrimination event and stress, the confounding variable that I chose to include in the study was something called ethnic identity. And basically, ethnic identity is the level of acceptance um, that the individual has in who they are in terms of culture and ethnicity and that sort of thing. So, confounding variables absolutely impact your outcomes, but the problem with confounding variables is, one, can you identify the confounding variables? Two, can you collect data to measure those confounding variables, because that's going to allow you to control for confounding variables. But there's also a situation where there may be things influencing your dependent variable variability, and you're just unaware. You don't know what the confounding variables are, or you're not even thinking about a confounding variable, but they're still, exerting their impact on your outcomes. So confounding variables are very problematic. There are things we can do to control for the effect statistically, but you have to be able to identify the confounder and collect data that measures that confounder. All right, so your evaluation design. All right, so what's your approach going to be? Well, there's a lot of things that go into determining how extensive your evaluation is going to be, right? How much time do you have to conduct the evaluation? Evaluation takes a lot of time. Do you have that time available? Um, there's going to be costs associated with doing this, right? You have to pay people, for their time to work on it. There may be software needs, or maybe, maybe using somebody to collect data, those types of things. How many participants can be included in the evaluation? The more participants, the more robust your data set's going to be. But does that come at a cost? Can you afford that? Are you more interested in qualitative or quantitative data? Right? Because qualitative takes an inductive approach. Quantitative utilizes a deductive approach. They're strategically they're very different. So understanding which one you want to go with, or maybe you want to do a combination of both, that's going to influence the type of data. Qualitative data is different than quantitative data, so you have to decide that up front so that you're collecting the appropriate data. Do you have data analysis skills? um, if you don't, well, how are you going to statistically analyze your data, right? That could be a problem. um, if you do, great. If not, okay, well, where's this expertise going to come from? Is it important to be able to generalize your findings to other populations? In general, well, I hate to use that term, to describe the generalization term, but in general, that's what these research projects are all about, right? You're conducting an experiment on your sample, but you hope to be able to apply the results to a larger population so that more people can receive the benefit. Or you may be in a situation where, no, I'm just making an observational study. I just want to say something about this particular group. Generalizability, not that important to me. Um, so you just need to decide, what it is you want the results of this evaluation to be able to do and convey. Are stakeholders concerned with validity and reliability? For this one, it doesn't matter, right? you're selecting the evaluation plan, you need to be concerned about validity and reliability of the instruments that you're using to collect this data. Otherwise, I mean, what's the point? Do you have the ability to randomize participants into experimental and control groups? We'll speak about this. Randomization is very effective at controlling for the effects of different bias and confounders. So randomization, the more you can do, that's a good thing, but in practice, randomization is very difficult to achieve. Do you have access to a comparison group, right? So again, one thing we can do to evaluate effectiveness of a program is to look at two different groups that are kind of similar and see if they're performing at the same level, right? If they're both receiving the intervention. This is different than a control group. A control group wouldn't receive the intervention, and we're trying to see, well, how much better does the experimental group perform and we're trying to say that the difference is due to presence of the intervention. Okay, so a graphical representation of selecting your evaluation design. So step one, orientation to the situation. So basically, you're getting familiar with the context of the situation. You're looking at context specific resources, barriers or constraints, just anything that is unique to that particular situation that could influence your program outcome, right? You want to kind of take an inventory there. Okay, step two, defining the problem. Here's where your needs assessment comes into play. Once you define the problem, now we need to start thinking in terms of labeling our variables, right? Because that's going to determine how we evaluate this program is through the data collected in the various independent, dependent confounding variables that we identify. Okay, once we identify our variables, now we start thinking about our basic evaluation design, right? Is it going to be qualitative? Is it going to be quantitative? Or is it going to be a combination of the two? Again, you need to think about your expertise. What are you able to do, or what is your program group able to do in terms of evaluating qualitative and quantitative data? Now, once you decide on that design, now you can start thinking about okay, what data do I need? What's actually getting measured? How am I collecting that data? What analyses am I going to subject that data to? And in terms of your results, who needs to see these results? Do the stakeholders? Okay, well, what's their understanding and expertise in terms of evaluation? Well, you need to kind of consider that when you're putting together how this report is worded, that it speaks to your audience. All right, so in terms of quantitative and qualitative, just the concepts, they differ. They're the inverse. So quantitative, right, that's typically what people think about evaluation using data and hypotheses testing. But I want you to pay attention to the word deductive. So it uses deductive reasoning. So that means that we start off with a hypothesis, and we set out to test that hypothesis through observation, data collection, analyses, and we at the end we say, okay, this hypothesis is rejected, or we fail to reject. Qualitative works differently. So here we begin with making an observation, and we think, hey, something looks like it's going on, and we follow up with that observation, but the end result is we are forming a hypothesis. So again, conceptually, the two are evaluating things in a different way, and so you need just to be aware of those differences to make sure you're producing an evaluation result that is useful as far as determining the performance of your program. And like I said, it's common to see both involved when you guys do your student perception of teaching evaluation at the end of each semester. That's a mixture of both, right? There's a quantitative part where you respond on a Likert scale, but there's also a qualitative section where you can include comments. And like I said, both things tell you something different and to a different degree about the respondents' feelings about the questions and things that are being asked. Okay, different qualitative measures that are typically used. You can look at box 14.2. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory. If we look at Delphi technique, basically you use a series of surveys to drill down to the pertinent information. So you would administer a survey, right? And then based on the responses, maybe you ask some follow-up questions in a second survey, and based on those responses, right, you ask additional follow-up questions. So you may start out with kind of a general sense of what's going on, but based on responses, you're able to kind of narrow that down to a more specific level of data. Ethnographic studies. Here's where you really focus on the participants and their characteristics. And we're looking at, because potentially those characteristics could be confounding variables in your outcomes. Film film ethnography, same as the ethnographic studies, except it's more of a retrospective because you're making observations on images like photographs or videos, things like that. Let's see. In-depth interviewing is different from regular interviewing in that you have it's a more formal process where you have highly identified individuals that you're interviewing, and you're taking in the whole situation, right? Not only are you interested in the responses to questions, but here you have an opportunity, because of the one-on-one interaction, to observe body language, facial expressions, and those types of things for whatever qualitative information that those types of things can give you. Okay, a nominal group process. Here you're working with participants, but a highly identified group of participants that seem to be very knowledgeable about maybe some of the topics that your program's addressing or the activities that your program is addressing. So feedback from them is probably going to be more valuable than someone that maybe really doesn't understand the process as much as these individuals. Participant observer studies. Here's where the observer is actually embedded in the target population. So maybe one of your strategies is utilize a group fitness classes. Well, the observer would actually participate in the group fitness class and is able to relate program concerns from a participant perspective. It could be something that is beneficial. Quality circle. This would be where there's a group that meets and discusses how the program's performing, and they do that on a regular basis. So kind of like a focus group, but it's a focus group that continues to meet through program implementation. And then unobtrusive techniques. These are just going to be basic observations. You're observing participants as they go through the program, but you're not interacting with them. You're just kind of trying to see how the program's working without any influence of an observer being present. Okay, so experimental control and comparison group. So experimental group, this is going to be the group that receives the intervention, right? So you expect to see a change in health status, behaviors, whatever it is you've set up. A control group, you want them to be as similar to the experimental group in terms of their demographic characteristics and those sorts of things. You want really the only main difference to be in your control group is that they aren't exposed to the intervention. What this allows you to do is say, look, if there's any differences between the experimental and the control group, then most likely it's going to be due to being exposed to an intervention. That's what you hope for. But confounders really make that difficult. A comparison group, um, here's where both your experimental and your comparison group, they're similar as can be. They're both receiving the intervention. So you would expect them to perform at the same level. If there are differences, then most likely it's going to be due to confounding, but there's something we'd want to look at. Um, One of the reasons why you would have a comparison group rather than a control group is if there's some ethical consideration. So say we had an intervention that was designed to, I don't know, improve health status, right? And that's the expectation, is it's going to improve health status. Should you deny that benefit from a group of potential participants just so they could serve as a control group? Ethically, that may not be, appropriate. So why not offer the intervention to both groups so they could potentially see the benefits, and we'll just do an experimental and a comparison group evaluation design. Your measurements, typically evaluation is associated with after the program ends. I'm trying to break that mold. So we want to look at before and after the program, but actually what we want to do is several times before, during, and after the program. The more data you're collecting and analyzing, the better idea or understanding of how the program is performing you walk away with. So if it's within your means and abilities, evaluate frequently and as often as you can. Pre-test and post-test is the typical evaluation layout, right? You pre-test before the intervention, post-test after. So therefore the difference that you're interested in, you want to be able to kind of say that, okay, well, the intervention played a role in this difference. All right, so the three types of evaluation design: experimental, quasi-experimental, observational. It has mostly the difference between experimental and quasi and observational initially starts off with can you manipulate the variables? Basically, do you get to select what variables are present and are measured? Okay, in experimental and quasi-experimental, there is variable manipulation. In the non-experimental, you don't get to manipulate variables, and I'll give you an example as we go through. But probably more of a significant difference between these three types is your ability to randomly assign people to your different groups: your experimental group, control group, comparison group. What random assignment gives you is that all those confounders that you may be aware of, and even those you may not be aware of. The idea behind random assignment is that those confounders have an equal probability of either showing up in your experimental group or your control group. So what does that mean? That buys you an opportunity to balance out the effect of confounders, right? So theoretically there would be an equal number of confounders in each group. If those confounders are influencing the dependent variable, well, then they basically cancel out. So randomization is very powerful and effective at doing that. Quasi-experimental is where you can't do random assignment or true random assignment. Sometimes it's maybe you're looking at the effect of stressors on obese versus non-obese. Well, you really can't randomly assign people to an obese group or a non-obese group, right? They've already kind of self-determined that. So typically, mostly what you'll see in a lot of these intervention evaluations is the utilization of quasi-experimental, but it has everything to do with whether or not you're able to randomly assign people to your groups. Now, non-experimental, these are also called observational studies, right? So basically you're just observing your group of individuals, and you're observing the variables that are present. So there's no manipulation of variables. So I do a lot of observational studies, and one study I looked at sexting behaviors. Well, I can't manipulate that variable because if the group I'm observing, so say I utilize one section of one of the classes that I teach, if nobody is sexting in that group, well, I'm not going to be able to measure that variable. And I'm not going to set up a situation where I say, okay, well, half of you, I want you to, start sexting for the next 30 days. The other half, don't do that, and I'm going to compare. That doesn't work like that. So, observational studies, you don't get to pick and choose what variables are present, right? The target population kind of does that for you. And also, there's no randomization in that. It's just whatever group is there, that's the group that I'm observing. I'm not randomly assigning people to a group that I'm going to observe. So here's some nomenclature so that you can kind of look at how the different designs are put together. So if we go down to the bottom and look at the key, so R in parentheses means random assignment. So you can see under experimental design, right, it utilizes random assignment, where quasi and non-experimental design do not. Okay, so O is going to be your observation or your measurement, right? And if you have a sub number, like here's O sub 1 and O sub 2, that just means they're two time reference. So observation 1 occurs, time passes, then observation 2 occurs. And then X would be your intervention. So here with the difference between a pre-test post-test design with experimental group and control group, all right, both are randomly assigned. We take a baseline measure at 0.1 for both groups, but as we go through time, you'll see that only the experimental group is exposed to the intervention, and then we have a follow-up. And that's kind of how you interpret everything, all these different designs in terms of when you're collecting data, at what point are they exposed to the intervention, if they're exposed to the intervention, is there a random assignment. So you kind of want to sketch these out ahead of time, because like we go down here to time series design. All right, so we're following this group through time, and by looking at the nomenclature, we know that, okay, well, there's going to be multiple instances where we need to stop, collect data, right? And then after the third data point, we need to offer the intervention to our experimental group. The comparison group, in this case, isn't exposed to the intervention. Staggered treatment. So here's where I was talking about that ethical concern, right? So if you have a program that you expect to be beneficial in terms of health status, why deny it from a group simply for the sake of you being able to evaluate it in a certain way? So this staggered treatment design, you'll notice that the intervention exposure, right, each of the 4 groups is going to be exposed. It just happens over time. And then what you can do is in between those time points, you can kind of evaluate, okay, well, you're going to have a control group that hasn't received the intervention yet, right? We can compare that to the group that has received the intervention, but ethically your concerns are addressed because all the groups are going to receive any potential benefit from exposure. Validity, there's all sorts of validity, but internal validity, what we're looking at here is, did our program plan produce the changes that we expected the program plan to produce? Okay. Here's where you go to this bottom bullet. They mention randomization. Okay, confounding can be a very difficult threat to internal validity, and randomization is something that can help alleviate that threat. But the better job you can do at identifying confounders, coming up with a way to measure confounders, then you can control for their effect statistically. Threats to internal validity, Um, you can go through these. Most of these, again, are pretty self-explanatory. There are a few that maybe I'll address. So, statistical regression. Um, what they're talking about here is that the effect of outliers, either to the low extreme or the high extreme, that could impact your analyses results. So you want to kind of take a look at there. And there's things you can do to address outliers, but it's something you need to look at. Interaction effect. So here's where individuals from your experimental group and your control group, they interact, they talk with one another. Hey, what are you guys doing? And based on that interaction, right, they start maybe becoming more aware of what um, you're trying to do in terms of measurement, and maybe they start to you know perform differently because they're trying to help you meet those expectations, or whatever. But that's something that can come up. Compensatory equalization of treatments. Um, you know, the control group, right? They're not receiving the intervention, and they may feel, you know, different, or they may be act differently. Could result in a compensatory rivalry. The control group says, "Hey, look, they don't expect us to perform well because we're not receiving this intervention. Let's prove them wrong." Resentful demoralization. Um, Here's where, because they're not being given the intervention, maybe they feel like, well, they must not care about us, right? That goes back to that ethical consideration of having a control group versus a comparison group, giving them exposure to the intervention maybe over a time series. And then most likely it's not going to be one single threat that you have to deal with. It's going to be a combination of these things, and they could potentiate each other and create bigger problems. So um, internal validity is something you need to be aware of, and if you can take action, well, take action. External validity, here's where a term is called generalizability comes into play. So basically, can you apply the findings from your program to a larger population? Right, that's generalizability, and that is what external validity is. Um, Bias, right? Trying to control for the effects of bias, certain things that you can do. A blind study, the participants don't know which group they're assigned to, right? So that's going to take out that rivalry concern. A double-blind study, the participants, they don't know what group they're in, and the researchers don't know who's in a control group, who's in a experimental group. They're just working with the data. And then a triple blind study, okay, nobody knows anything about the experimental or control group. Again, you're just trying to take away some of the biases that I'll talk about here in a minute. Okay, so external validity. So the green box represents, this is what I found in my population after the intervention. That's what we should expect in another population. What can get in the way of this being a smooth transition? Social desirability. Here's where participants are aware of. Okay, so maybe you ask a question. Do you binge drink? More than multiple times a week. Well, people may, when they're thinking about answering that question, they may think about, well, if I say I binge drink, 5 out of 7 days a week, that's going to be looked at differently than someone that says they don't binge drink in terms of being socially acceptable. So maybe I better just respond to how I think is socially acceptable. Um, Expectancy effect. Here's where your program administrators start to project basically what they expect the participants to do, or how the participants are performing, and that starts to influence how the participants are actually performing. maybe we're talking about physical activity behavior. Maybe in the real life, the people aren't that physically active, but when they show up for program events, they know that the expectation is that everybody's going to be physically active. That's what healthy people do. So they engage in more physical activity within the program, and it appears that they're physically active, but then when they go home, not so much. Um, the the Hawthorne effect is when similar to expectancy effect, but again, the person is really aware, and they alter their behaviors simply because they know they're being observed for that behavior. Um, maybe I said, I'm going to be observing how many times each of you scratch your nose. Right, we're sitting in a classroom. If that's in the back of your mind, it's like he's going to be counting the number of times I scratch my nose. So I'm not going to scratch my nose because I know he's watching. Or maybe when he looks away, then I'll sneak in a scratch. Right? That's the Hawthorne effect. Right? You don't want that. You're trying to observe behaviors as they would naturally occur. And then placebo effect. Most of you are familiar with what a placebo is. A person thinks they're experiencing some benefit due to exposure to something, but they haven't been exposed to the intervention. That phenomenon can work, but all these things are going to influence your outcome results, which influences basically your evaluation of your program. So again, not a real in-depth look at evaluation design, but I just want to kind of introduce some concepts so that you understand and appreciate that evaluation is a very comprehensive thing to take on.